Welcome back to the college at Littlemore, where I'm here with Dr. Stephen Morgan talking about John Henry Newman. One of the great advantages of being here to film today in the college at Littlemore is that we're surrounded by so many relics, artefacts of the life of Blessed John Henry Newman. And amongst them is this remarkable Victorian desk. It doesn't look too much like a desk, but Victorians would often write standing up. Newman wrote the Apologia Pro Vita Sua in Birmingham at a desk just like this that stands up. But this desk is important because it's also the desk which was used as an altar when Newman was received into the Catholic Church after his 2-day confession by Blessed Dominic Barberi.
It's remarkable to be standing in front of a desk at which one Blessed Dominic Barberi, now in heaven, celebrated Mass in order to bring into the full communion of the Church another Blessed, John Henry Newman, a physical reminder of the transmission of the faith from heart to heart.
We're in Littlemore and there's so much here which is of interest and of note, and just further down the room here there's a cabinet with some more artefacts relating to Newman's life, including this, his MA hood. Perhaps you might say a little bit about that.
Yes, his MA hood, his academic hood from the University of Oxford, the Master of Arts hood worn by Anglican clergymen to preach and to conduct services. And this was the hood that Newman was wearing when he preached his last sermon as an Anglican, the sermon known as the Parting of Friends. And at the end of the sermon, he rather dramatically, maybe melodramatically, took off the hood and laid it aside. Several months later, when he became a Catholic, he'd resigned his fellowship of Oriel College. The university formally removed from him the dignity, the degree. He was degraded. He was no longer a Master of Arts, a situation that grieved him, although he understood that it was inevitable. And 30 years later, his old college, Trinity College, made him its first honorary fellow, and he was able to return to the city that he'd spent so much of his time in.
And that desire for good education, that recognition of the importance of education, also led him to write about education and to become involved in education once more, although not in his beloved Oxford.
No, he was never allowed to come to Oxford. There was a plan to establish an oratory in Oxford, but the Holy See said that if that was to happen, Newman wasn't to come and live there, and the idea died. The fact that an oratory was established in Oxford in the 1980s, about the time actually that his course for canonization started in Rome, is perhaps an interesting historical coda to Newman's life. But he was asked to go to Ireland to establish a university. When we were talking about the University of Oxford, I was talking about it as a place for training of Anglican clergy and its Anglican identity. In Ireland, there was a similar situation at a place called Trinity College, Dublin, and you had to be an Anglican to go there. And even when the Anglicans said that Catholics and nonconformists could go there, the Catholic bishops said they weren't going to allow that to happen because they were worried that it would lead to a dilution of the faith of the Irish Catholics. Here in England, the same attitude was taken by the bishops. And actually, Catholics weren't allowed to come to Oxford until the 1880s, the late 1880s, the very end of Newman's life, by the bishops themselves. Unfortunately, Newman's attempts to establish the university in Ireland were frustrated by a difference of view about what universities were for. And that finds its expression in a fantastic book called The Idea of a University, which is perhaps the most significant educational tract about higher education written for hundreds of years. And in it, Newman returns to that notion that there is a moral component. It is about the education of the whole man. And again, we're talking of a period when it was men, but the significance is just not the intellectual formation, but the moral formation. The bishops really wanted it to be about a religious formation. And Newman was more concerned to create an ethos, we return to that word, an ethos that would allow somebody to situate their belief in a life of virtue, a life of habituated virtue, which we might call holiness, and an intellectually coherent faith. That didn't match the bishop's expectations in Ireland, and unfortunately Newman's involvement with what is now the National University of Ireland came to an end. Many of Newman's enterprises in life ended in what looked like failure, but out of those failures grew perhaps lasting legacies, and the idea of a university is certainly a lasting legacy from that period.
You mentioned earlier that many of Newman's most important events in his life were memorialised in his letters, and the night that he was received into the Catholic Church in this room, he comments that he was received by Blessed Dominic Barberi, and we understand that that was in front of a fireplace. Now, this isn't an original fireplace, but is there to depict the place perhaps where Blessed Dominic Barberi received Newman.
Yes, these buildings have been much altered over the last 160 years or so. Several years ago, a friend of mine who was living here while studying in Oxford, studying Newman, a man called Sean McLaughlin, painted this to represent the fire, because we think this is the place in which the fire might have been. It's now a doorway, but we think that's where the fire was, and Sean McLaughlin painted this to remind us of this. I might humorously observe he's a better theologian than a painter.
From shadows to the warmth and the light of the Catholic Church.
Yes, perhaps. No, but I think you're right to say that this is about the light of truth and the warmth of truth. I mentioned to you earlier in conversation how when Newman first came here in 1841, these were really originally coaching stables where horses were kept. And Newman made of it a home, a place where he could live in common with his friends as they worked out what the implications of understanding that faith was. So in that sense, this is like that desk. This is a physical manifestation of the reality of John Henry Newman.
You can see very much how the buildings, you have to mind your head as you come through, but
I'm rather shorter than you.
How the buildings still have that sort of farmhouse feel to them, really. And I wonder, we were talking earlier about Newman and the incarnation, Newman and the understanding of God made man in Jesus Christ. I wonder if he ever stopped to think about the relationship between the place where he was, this stable, and the place of the incarnation, in a sense. It might seem a little trite to us, but there's something beautiful about that, something romantic perhaps even.
Well, I think so. And we've spoken a great deal about Newman and antiquity, Newman and the Fathers. That's the kind of religious imagination that he encountered in the Fathers, for whom none of these physical accidents were accidents, that they were to be read. It was an enchanted world, a world occupied by God, a world created by God, a world that existed for God and for God's purposes. So perhaps he did reflect upon that. Perhaps I haven't read enough of his meditations and to be too certain about it.
And here as well, there is a sense of this being a home, being a place where study and prayer and all of the things that we've discussed, all the things we know were present in Newman's life could take place. And we're here actually now just at his room,
yes.
The place where he slept, where he read, where he studied, where he prayed. So let's just go inside and take a look. So we've been round the college, we've seen the old stable blocks that have been turned into the rooms, and here we are in Newman's own room. And here on the desk is a letter that he wrote to Cardinal Manning, written on the 8th of October 1845, the day before he was received into the church.
Yes, because Manning at that stage was an Anglican clergyman, like Newman. He was only to become a Catholic 5 or 6 years after Newman. But Newman spent the days before his being received into the church writing to his friends and his family. And Manning, in spite of the fact that the relationship between Manning and Newman was rather tense in later years, Manning had been a friend of Newman's for many years, and he felt the need to explain to his friends what he was doing. And so he writes to Manning. My dear Manning, I send you just a line, having many letters to write. You'll see it requires no answer. Father Dominic, who is in his way from Staffordshire to Belgium, sleeps here tonight. He does not know of my intention, but I shall ask him to receive me into what I believe to be the one true fold. This will not go till all is over. Ever yours, my dear Manning, very affectionately, John H. Newman. He also wrote to his sister, who was concerned that he would spend the time after his being received here, and she urged him to move on. And here we are in a very simple room. We can perhaps imagine this as a place of some kind of personal prayer, some personal agony, as he faced up to the claims of truth on him, the real assent that he had to give, the power of the concrete. There's another room, another bedroom, the bedroom in the Oratory in Birmingham, where as a cardinal he lived, and that's also a room of some prayer and some agony. In fact, after he became a cardinal, because the rituals of the church for cardinals in the Victorian era were so complicated, he had permission to have an altar in his bedroom, and he was able to celebrate Mass there privately, because he wasn't able to celebrate Mass without great fanfare and great ceremony in the Oratory church.
Again, that idea of the formation of the whole person is something which he brought from his experience, as you rightly said, in Oxford. But I suppose also that understanding of the common life that's present in the Oratory of St Philip Neri, that living together, that praying together, eating together, the importance of finding the life of faith as a life and not merely as a sort of existence that's sort of, separated from what we do on a Sunday, but that whole offering of oneself to God, something which he himself had acknowledged and found to be necessary by his reception into the church in 1845.
I think that's exactly right, and that's why that word ethos is so important in trying to understand Newman and those other members of the Oxford movement. It wasn't faith dissociated from the way we live our lives. It was religion, properly understood as culture, that is the way in which we live, the way in which we move, the way in which we have our being. To use an expression drawn from Anglican patrimony, that kind of expression of St Paul's understanding of what it is to be a human being became absolutely determinative for those members of the Oxford movement, and it shines through in Newman. And if you were to ask me what is the present significance of Newman in the church, I would think that notion of religion as an ethos, as a way of living, that united the whole life, that drew its strength from and ordered all its activity towards the worship of Almighty God in the liturgy, where we encounter Christ. The idea of Christianity, God become man for our salvation in the person of Jesus Christ, in the power of the Holy Spirit, would be a very, very strong theme that I would want to draw out of Newman.
I can't let you get away with saying the words Anglican patrimony without speaking a little bit about the Ordinariates. I said at the beginning that I'm a priest of the personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, and on the badge which I'm wearing you can see the coat of arms of Walsingham, but also the coat of arms of John Henry Newman, who is one of the patrons of the Ordinariate. And that whole ethos, that patrimony, that way of being, that understanding of religion, not just as something that we do for an hour on Sunday morning, or an hour and 15 minutes if we're in my parish, but is instead the complete entering into the life of Jesus Christ by oneself. That, I think, is something which is very present in the mind of those who have come into the Catholic Church through the provisions of the personal ordinariates that were established by Pope Benedict. And I wonder if we can just talk for a very brief moment about that connection. Pope Benedict had a love for Newman, a great enthusiasm for Newman. In a unusual set of circumstances, he beatified Newman in England. Usually when a beatification takes place, it's done by a local bishop in their country, but Pope Benedict wanted to do that whilst he was here. I wonder if that understanding of religion as a virtue, of the importance of the Christian ethic, I wonder if that is present in the understanding of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, in such a way that he draws together the life of John Henry Newman, the Anglican patrimony that he identifies and claims for the Catholic Church in the Ordinary Oats, and in perhaps other ways as well, the re-enchantment of the liturgy that went on during that pontificate.
Yes, I think it's very noticeable, that state visit to England in 2010. One of the things that Pope Benedict was keen to have was an experience, an expression of the beauty of religion. And he's written on a number of occasions about his love for some of the musical patrimony of the English Church in the period after the Reformation. And by that, he doesn't just mean Anglican music. He means, I think, also the music of Catholics like Byrd and Tallis. But the significance of Newman's intellectual work for Pope Benedict, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. Benedict, as a young theologian, is a man whose life was concerned with finding a credible way of being able to retell old truths. Mm-hmm. And remember, retelling old truths in a Europe that had just experienced 2 catastrophic wars, where people were really very cynical, and where a kind of hyper-rationalized theology was not going to cut it. Yeah. And he finds in Newman a subtle mind.
And Ratzinger discovers Newman, as you said, at the end or during the Second World War, and reads his translation of, I think, of the Grammar of Assent by St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Yes. I think this is beautiful, sort of, the Bavarian Pope who finds in this very English character at the end of the Second World War something that brings alive the faith and deepens Ratzinger's own understanding of the truth.
Yes, Newman, the second half of Newman's life, although it's a time of tranquility in terms of his religious opinions, although not in terms of his relationships with the projects he's involved in, it is a time of tranquility in his religious opinions, and it allows him to produce some very, very significant pieces of work. And in 1870, he published an essay in aid of a grammar of assent, it's called. I'm afraid that's a rather Victorian title. We might just simply have called it Grammar of Assent. It's quite a lengthy book, and there's some evidence that he was working on the ideas of it for 20 years or more. But what he's looking to do there is to present an understanding of a philosophical approach to religion that is coherent, yes, that takes seriously the affective and the intellectual, and perhaps seeks to undermine an over-reliance on a kind of empiricist, scientific view of the world, which presents the idea that you can only prove things as being true by some kind of process of strict mathematical logic or by experimentation. Mm-hmm. And Newman says that isn't how we go about living our lives. We go about living our lives believing things on the grounds of what he calls converging and convincing proofs. Various things that don't quite get you from A to Z, but get you close enough to know that that's where the journey's going. And when you have 3 or 4 of those pointing to the same Z, then it's a reasonable journey to make. That's a very, very significant way to go about doing theology. It's a way of going about doing theology which, in fact, the First Vatican Council endorses when it adopts St. Thomas's theology about knowing God through the created order, that human beings can know by means of the created order with certainty of the existence of God. That's done by that process of converging and convincing proofs, which Newman calls the illative sense. And I think that appeals to the mind of a man like Ratzinger.
We've already begun to speak a little bit about John Henry Newman's legacy, theological and otherwise, in the life of the church, and perhaps we might return to that and discuss his ongoing legacy in the life of the church today, and to share that with others. Deacon Stephen Morgan, thank you so much for spending this time with us here in the college at Littlemore.
Father Bradley, thank you.